Kia ora koutou. Welcome to Wigram, to the Air Force Museum. My name's Simon Moody and I'm going to be talking to you today about the birth of air power in New Zealand. It's going to be a very general overview because we don't have a huge amount of time, but I want you to take away at least a sense of the somewhat tortuous journey that we had to go through in order to get to the stage that we were in World War II. It's set against the contrasting context of increasing technology, modernisation, and physical connectivity that was developing between the wars, and the legacy of a recent and destructive conflict. International insecurity played a strong role, and the changing nature of imperial defence and political will in New Zealand will also feature. But I believe we have to go right back to the First World War and beyond to really understand what happened between the wars here in New Zealand with the creation of the Air Force. Let's go back to before World War I. One of the great visionaries of New Zealand air power in its early years was Sir Henry Wigram. Wigram visited Europe in the pre-war period. He was an influential politician, mayor of Christchurch at one point, and also a businessman and newspaper owner. And on this visit to Europe, he saw how aviation was developing in Europe, in particular military aviation, and he brought those ideas back with him to New Zealand. He spoke to Parliament, recommending that they explore the options of military aviation here in New Zealand, but really New Zealand wasn't ready for such an undertaking, economically or indeed militarily, and so his words fell on deaf ears. Just a short time later, we did, however, receive our very first military aircraft. So in 1913, the Imperial Air Fleet Committee in London sent this Blériot 11, named Britannia, to New Zealand, and it was demonstrated up in Auckland during 1914 for a short period, at which point it was then crated up and sent back to Wellington. And when the war broke out, it was sent back to the UK. So that was another false start for military aviation here. Really, it took the outbreak of war in 1914 to start stimulating interest in military aviation. Two schools were founded here in New Zealand to train military pilots for the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service. The first by Walsh brothers, Leo and Vivian, up in Kohimarama near Auckland, and they trained pilots using float planes in the Waitemata Harbour. They also produced some of the most successful New Zealand pilots of the war, including Keith Caldwell, the leading fighter ace that we produced. Shortly after, in 1916, Sir Henry finally got his chance. Like the Walsh brothers, his school would train pilots for the British Air Forces. Over 180 passed through Wigram, or Sockburn as it was in those days, and surprisingly neither school lost anyone killed in flying accidents, which for the First World War was a major achievement. Most of those who trained here at Sockburn, however, didn't see action because their training took so long and they took so long to get to Europe that the war was pretty much over by the time that happened. So to summarise World War I, we had about 800 participants here from New Zealand working in various areas of military aviation, which is a pretty remarkable figure given the size of the country. Of those, roughly 10%, about 70, were killed, and 40% of those were in flying accidents. So what we get at the end of the war is an influx of a cadre of personnel who have recent military aviation experience. But nothing really happens until the following year, following the armistice, when this gentleman here, on the right, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Vere Bettington, commonly known as Zulu because of his South African origins, he was sent from London to advise the New Zealand government on the potential of aviation, in particular military aviation, here in New Zealand. He travelled the country, spoke to various people, looked at various sites, inspected Sockburn, and came up with a set of proposals that he felt would work as a logistics specialist. He had a constant battle with the Minister of Defence, Sir James Allen, and ultimately the government turned around and decided that his claims of us needing to have several squadrons, set up an air board and invest more heavily in aviation were just far too expensive in a post-war bleak economic environment. And so poor old Bettington's proposals were not accepted, but he represents the very first serious attempt to actually investigate what we should do in terms of military aviation. But nothing comes of this, which is obviously not great. However, with Bettington do come several aircraft, Imperial gift aircraft for him to demonstrate, and others follow, because there's a huge glut of aircraft available still in the UK. And these form the basis of operations, first by the two flying schools and later by the fledgling Air Force. Bettington's false start is in a sense a shame, and you can almost argue that the measure of enthusiasm for his proposals could be measured by this statement by JMS Ross in the official history. The measure of enthusiasm which Bettington's report aroused in New Zealand military circles can be gauged by the fact that by 1920 it had been lost and only odd papers could be found in the Defence Department, and not until 1929 was a complete copy found in private hands and placed on file. However, not everything was ignored. An air board was created, and that covered both civilian and military aviation. And in 1923, with a worsening economic situation, the two flying schools basically nearing bankruptcy, it was decided that the government would step in and purchase the assets of both of those companies, including the aerodrome at Sockburn. And this was also heavily influenced by Henry Wigram's very generous offer of £10,000 to sweeten the deal. And lo and behold, military aviation first found a footing here in New Zealand. Sockburn was renamed Wigram in honour of Sir Henry's generosity, and the New Zealand Permanent Air Force was formed, consisting of 4 officers and 2 other ranks initially, hardly much of an air force, but it's a start. And also, at the same time, the New Zealand Air Force, which consisted of over 70 World War I veterans who were basically the territorial arm of the force, that came into being. Now, their main role was basically to participate annually in refresher courses here at Wigram, and those 2-week courses would allow them to keep their skills up to scratch. So there was that cadre being used already in the early 1920s. By 1928 there were 5 officers and 14 other ranks, so there had been some improvement. But Alex Spencer has kind of argued in his book, recent book, Air Power, that the Air Force was in very grave danger of being stillborn in the 1920s. Anyway, the RAF came to advise once more. This time, Sir John Salmond, who was actually posted to Australia to advise the Australian government, came to New Zealand in 1928 to do a very similar thing to Bettington. And what he came up with was actually very similar to Bettington as well. Like him, his vision was firmly based on the RAF model and was somewhat ambitious in scope. 9 squadrons, £1.2 million, and an annual expenditure of another £500,000. This was not going to happen in New Zealand with the economic situation in the late 20s. And what others have often overlooked too is that the New Zealand government had also made a significant investment in setting up a new base on the North Island at Hobsonville on the Waitemata Harbour. So, basically, they didn't have the money available. They had an added complication as well of the Imperial gift aircraft wearing out. Look away now if you love World War I warbirds, because this is guaranteed to break your heart. So the government not only had to buy new aircraft, which they did, Hawker Tomtits and Gloucester Grebes, to fill that gap, but there was also, of course, an economic global crisis, to use a modern term, in 1929, and this had a profound effect on the development of air power. Just after that, New Zealand deployed aircraft overseas for the first time, and it's no coincidence that it was a colonial policing operation, right on the model of contemporary RAF activities, and so I find it quite interesting that that was the first occasion in which New Zealand actually deployed aircraft overseas. It really does ape the sort of parent service over in the UK. Also in 1930, the Territorial Air Force is formed, and it basically reorganises the New Zealand Air Force of territorials into 4 squadrons, mostly flying ex-civilian or DH-60s, and they basically based on the four major centres of Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch and Dunedin. A symbolic occurrence happens in 1934 when the actual name RNZF, or Royal New Zealand Air Force, is royally sanctioned, and that in a way kind of sets the momentum in place for further developments, which occur the following year when the first modern aircraft are purchased by the New Zealand government. The redoubtable Vickers Wildebeests. 12 of these are ordered, 6 for each island and each of the 2 bases, and they form the backbone basically of our aircraft fleet now for the next 5 to 6 years. In 1936 we have a Labour government, and things are very different economically to what they had been just a few years earlier, both politically and economically. And given the war clouds were starting to appear in Europe, and there was a growing threat from Japan, which Australia had already reacted to in their expansion plans, it was decided that an RAF officer once again would come over from the UK to advise the government on expansion of our potential air forces. Now, Ralph Cochrane was an experienced World War I pilot. He flew bombers in World War I, and also a disciple of Trenchard and Trenchard's views on bombing. So he was very much influenced by his background and his thinking when he came here. He kept very detailed diaries. Most of what he saw as he travelled around the country was quite impressive. He generally felt that most of the personnel were very confident, but he did feel that there was a lot of penny pinching. On one occasion at Wigram he wrote, "I saw several examples of penny-wise policy buildings put up in a minimum size and already too small, though not yet finished." So he was quite critical of quite a few of the things that he encountered. What he recommended was as follows: that New Zealand should have a strike force, if you like, of 3 Wellington squadrons, which would be able to attack shipping or enemy forces at distance off the New Zealand coast. That very much fell into his Trenchard thinking. Second thing he recommended was the creation of infrastructure. So having a headquarters, and organisation, and physical infrastructure too. So the creation of new bases at Ahakia, at Whenuapai and at Woodburn, and the expansion of Hobsonville and Wigram at the same time. Now, it was an interesting idea because, of course, these are very ambitious, more ambitious even than Bettington or Salmond had. But the Labour government was very keen on investment. Some of the cabinet had pacifist ideas in the past, but they also recognised the economic benefits of such a big expansion plan to the economy. And they also recognised the growing threat. So the report was accepted after discussions in December 1936 because the international situation was quite grave, and there was a recognisable threat and a requirement to defend and assist the home country of the UK and provide extra men and potential aircrew for future conflicts. So this is, in a sense, how the Air Force came to be. And on the 1st of April 1937, it became an independent service at long last from the Defence Department. And a public kind of propaganda campaign was also employed. Here we have the pageant in 1938. The whole Air Force is pretty much here in Rongotai and Wellington, and it's displaying the Air Force that we have in 1938 for the public to see, something that hadn't happened that much before. So it was a very slow process. It was slow to start, and it had several other false starts and interruptions. But from 1937 onwards, expansion was rapid. Aircrew started to be trained in both New Zealand and in the UK. And with the outbreak of war, expansion was very, very quick indeed. And even quicker after the fall of Singapore and the Pearl Harbor experience when Japan entered the war. So the next decade would see the RNZF play a key role in the victories over Germany, Italy and Japan. By 1944, there were over 40,000 personnel serving. This expansion had been a remarkable feat, and it had been done in the hot cauldron of a total war. So whilst it had been a long journey and not without complications, the visions of Bettington, Salmond and Cochrane were ultimately realised, and New Zealand could take its rightful place as an air power player. Thank you.